Fun times in Cleveland again.
Still Cleveland.
Come on down to Cleveland town, everyone. Under construction since 1868. See our river that catches on fire. It's so polluted that all our fish have. We see the sun almost 3 times a year. This guy has at least 2 DUIs. The flats look like a Scooby-Doo ghost town. Don't slow down in East Cleveland or you'll. Our economy's based on LeBron James. Buy a house for the price of a VCR. Our main export is crippling depression. We're so that we think this is art. It could be worse though, at least we're not Detroit. We're not Detroit.
If you were a wrestling fan, you might have wanted Cleveland to be Detroit entering the 1960s, as the Motor City was booming with great pro wrestling coming from the mind of Ed Farhat. Farhat, who was also known as the Sheik, in our last episode bought out Johnny Doyle to take over the territory as Doyle and Barnett went to create the first WCW, which in a way was their second national promotion, as they just ran a multi-state, multi-promoter network of talent, rivaling any booking office or governing body. Historically speaking, I'm Matt Ryan, and this is the secret wrestling history of the first national wrestling promotion. After our look at the cluster that was the 1950s and early 1960s in pro wrestling, we return to one of the key players in our story, Pedro Martinez. The promoter, fresh from punching Toots Mott in the face, took back Western New York in a long battle with former world champion and promoting partner Ed Don George. He then told the NWA to go itself soon after signing the NWA's consent decree and would go independent. Luckily, though, Martinez would have his wide world of wrestling, which was majorly syndicated across the United States, emanating from Buffalo's Memorial Auditorium. And while Buffalo would be the stronghold for Martinez, Cleveland was a far more tenuous operation, as he would look to poach the market after the town would see a variety of names look to make it their own with a varying degree of success. Much like Cleveland Browns quarterbacks, without the success part. Per Pro Wrestling History, Martinez would begin in the fall of 1958, running on Thursday nights, with most cards taking place at the Cleveland Arena, with a couple of cards taking place at the Masonic Temple, Central Armory, and Public Auditorium. Martinez wouldn't take a huge leap into the waters of the Cuyahoga just yet, as in 1962, Larry Atkins and Buckeye Sports Enterprises would run some shows. Now, if you watched our last episode, and I don't know why you didn't, that name would be familiar because Atkins was set to partner with Vincent J. McMahon and place Toots Mott as the booker in Cleveland for what they were planning as the Worldwide Wrestling Association, and we'll have a little more on that a little bit later on in the episode. And while the early 1960s would see the rise of Jim Brown and a fair share of NFL championships and appearances in the city of Cleveland, wrestling would be scattershot in the town until another name we mentioned a few times in this series, and in this episode, the Sheik Ed Farhat made a play in 1965, but only lasted a few months. For some reason, no matter the promoter, no matter the group, no matter the talent, Cleveland could not sustain itself as a wrestling market. Meanwhile, a few years earlier, on the other side of the northern border of the United States, a kid from Hamilton, Ontario, born Dennis Arnold Waters, would be preparing to become the most well-known wrestler on this side of the Erie.
I actually started in the business around age 13, so that would be about 1956. The Fez were active then, and a bunch, and I started in a small gymnasium, a community center called in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, which at each end of the town had 2 ex-pro wrestlers who were, their end game was to have a gym and teach weight training and physical fitness, and also pro wrestling to those that wanted to take it up, or just amateur/pro wrestling.
So he goes from 6'3", 159 at 15 to 6'4", over 260. And according to his extensive interviews with Gary Cubetta of 57talk.com, and I cannot tell you enough how much these interviews are going to play into the rest of this series. Just awesome research and awesome content for us to mine here and find some secret wrestling history. But he was soon benching 440 and would learn under trainer and shooter Jack Wentworth And before he would be known as Johnny Powers, he would enter the ring as Lord Anthony Lansdowne in small little Canadian shindy shows. Nothing like getting your gimmick from the promoter, eh? But by 17, he'd make his way to, that's right, you guessed it,
Detroit!
And this is still not the guy working at full time at this point. He's already working for the Doyle Detroit promotion in 1960 while attending McMaster University with dreams of not only being a wrestler, but studying geology or becoming a poet and possibly becoming a poetry professor. That is a variety pack of careers. However, he would become a full-time worker in the Michigan territory, looking to model himself after Lou Thesz, Gene Kiniski, Carl Gotch, and Buddy Rogers. Powers viewed wrestling as an art form, and as an artist, you study other artists. Saying that wrestling is an art form at any point before, let's say, 2006 or 7, shit, even now in some wrestling-based spaces, could get you called a bunch of names, threatened, hands thrown upon you, but Powers thinking like that in the 1960s was fairly revolutionary.
Early on, part of what I brought to the table, I guess, was the fact that I was really an artist. And I viewed myself as an artist early on. Didn't have a paintbrush. I had a body. And that body was to be worked on to be presentable in a gladiator context, in a ring, a wrestling ring, or a boxing ring. Because I wasn't sure I had 4 pro boxing bouts, which gave me 4 major headaches, and I decided that was a little stupid. But I wasn't sure if I didn't want to go to become a pro boxer. But I ended up a pro wrestler. And so, but early on, I was scoping for things, and I was evolving my own persona. Like, my heroes were folks that were business heroes, and they ended up helping the promoting end. I can remember early stages, 14, 15, reading Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, Maxwell Maltz, a plastic surgeon, who wrote a seminal book called Psycho-Cybernetics, which was basically about he would take a girl with maybe too big a nose and give her a beautiful looking nose, but she didn't think she was still pretty because it was about the internal image. And I started trying to marry the internal image of an athlete and myself and watch other folks and pull that all together. It's called NLP now, Neuro Linguistic Programming, and it's about mentoring and modeling against other successful folks. So that's kind of how we morphed in. So I took those kind of curiosities, artistic leanings and inclinations, and a bunch of rage. I don't know where I got it. My mom says I'm Irish and Scottish. Absolutely. I didn't know it then, but I was in the brand building mode, just like anybody else crafts a brand, IBM or Coca-Cola or Google or whatever, craft a brand and have that intellectual property. That I was crafting a Johnny Powers brand. I didn't have it that well thought out, and it was also, I love art. I love music, I love physical art, and for me, the performance in a ring was an art performance. It was, how can I maximize my art performance? Me as an individual, me with the other wrestler, me including the referee, me including all the fans, you know? It was an art presentation for me, and I would try to get in as deep and as much depth as I possibly could pull out of myself.
When talking of the men like Thesz and Rogers, Powers had a really interesting POV of the top guys of that era, or of any era.
Lou Thesz and Carl Gotch were always a little defensive. They always wanted to, in case you tried to take something from them, they were on guard. You cannot be on guard as an artist. You have to and give your maximum performance to get the natives, the fans, excited. You have to give some of yourself in that ring at times, and you're totally vulnerable and exposed to your opponent.
Powers' prophetic words help bring our story into more context, as Powers would get his big break in Detroit in 1963. At the very same time, Vince McMahon was going through it. Following all the calamity that came from Thez and Rogers' series of matches in late 1962 that would decide the fate of Capitol Wrestling, the office owned by McMahon and the National Wrestling Alliance, and to that extent, Rogers is the NWA World Champion. And while 1963 would begin with Rogers and McMahon unified, and in April the WWWF born as Rogers would be recognized as their world champion due to only losing to Thez in what promoter and WWWF President Willie Gilzenberg would call a non-title match. But Rogers also was alleged to have won a tournament in Rio de Janeiro, much like the same gimmick used 16 years later to explain why Pat Patterson was no longer the WWF North American champion, but instead was their Intercontinental champion. With all of that going on, in January of '63, Antonino Rocca dipped from Capitol Wrestling. Lacking what McMahon felt was the key for success not only in New York, especially in Madison Square Garden, but their northeastern territory with a litany of ethnic enclaves, a non-Anglo babyface was necessary as McMahon needed to do what McMahons tend to do business with people who they may or may not have fucked over and ran out of the territory. Bruno Sammartino had become a star rising out of his adopted hometown of Pittsburgh and would fast become Rocca's tag team partner and develop an immense popularity being the Italian Superman. Just a decade removed from being a gangly kid fresh from Italy who nearly died of rheumatic fever after his mother hid him in the mountains of Italy from German soldiers, he was main eventing Madison Square Garden and living his dream as a professional wrestler. The issue was that amid a decades-long skirmish amidst promoters to be bookers in Madison Square Garden. In late 1960, the nascent duo of Jack Pfeffer and former Mont running buddy Cola Quariani were sent packing from MSG after not being able to develop the same type of sellout attractions that came to the Garden in 1959, as Pedro Martinez's stable of wrestlers was not doing the job. The keys to the Garden would be turned over to McMahon, who the year earlier joined the NWA in a precautionary move, with Mont moving to Pittsburgh to manage operations there. That shakeup would basically be the reverse of what happened the year prior, as Pfeffer and Quariani got the booking gig inside Madison Square Garden and took Sammartino with them with a little bit of subterfuge, despite McMahon being an early fan of Sammartino's work following promoter Rudy Miller finding Sammartino in 1958 in their shared hometown of Pittsburgh. Not everyone was a fan of Sammartino at that time, though. Our old friend Dan Parker of the New York Daily Mirror would take some shots at Bruno in the January 18, 1960 edition, saying,
"With the Puerto Rican trade about milk dry, the wrestling brains are now about to woo the Italians who jilted them about 20 years ago by building up a berber of ordinary ability named Bruno Sammartino into a Superman."
But by 1961, Sammartino was no burper of ordinary ability, proving that he could be one of the highest drawing cards across the country, which is why on March 4th of that year, he would be called upon by Roy Shire to take part in Shire's first event at the Cow Palace, which would see 16,533 fans in the first of hundreds of events that would take place in that iconic venue. Issue was, McMahon wanted Sammartino in Baltimore that night, a big market for him. Sammartino would be suspended by the Maryland State Athletic Commission and essentially blackballed from the area until March, where he would return to Madison Square Garden and beat Eddie Graham by disqualification. Sammartino would appear on cards in and around MSG until February of 1962, where it seems he and McMahon's relationship really went sour, and Sammartino nearly quit the business before Frank Tunney of Toronto intervened, who would continue to use Sammartino despite his apparent blackballing. In Dave Meltzer's obituary for Bruno, during this time period, Sammartino was promised a run by Jim Barnett in Indianapolis, but would never be used by the advantageous promoter, possibly trying not to create more problems as McMahon's empire was beginning to expand, and were known to create problems for Barnett and Doyle, who were still trying to play nice with the NWA and gain membership. Yet in 1963, Sammartino would be lured back into the Capitol fold, but there was a catch. Much like El Gigante, Bruno wanted the belt. Well, he was gonna get it, but when? By late March of that year, Sammartino had returned to the cards and television, where he immediately set his sights on Buddy Rogers and the WWF World title. Rogers the same month would lose his claim to the WWA's world title, as on March 28th, the fledgling Cleveland outfit would see Jamaican star Dory Dixon beat Rogers in the land. And also, even though Rogers would still be a top star for Fred Kohler, the Chicago promoter would not claim Rogers as his world champion, Following the Thez encounter, news coming out around this time would instead have his International Wrestling Alliance. Yes, International Wrestling Alliance World Champion Moose Cholak. And if you're watching the video version of this, yes, he wore a moose head to the ring. Whether or not this was going to lead to the IWA, WWA, and WWF unifying their belts under one champion is anybody's guess. But with Rogers only under McMahon's auspices for Capital, it seemed like the perfect time to build to Sammartino and Rogers. In an angle that would work then, now, or forever, during the same episode of Capital Wrestling Television that declared Rogers the WWF Champion, or at least the same taping date, Sammartino returned to Capital Television and challenged Rogers for the world title, and to earn it, he'd put up $1,000, a little over $10K in 2025 money, to wrestle him on TV in DC to earn the title shot. Rogers would match that $1,000, and with both men giving checks to TV announcer Ray Morgan, they'd walk into the ring and settle things. The champion attempted to jump Sammartino before the bell, but Bruno was ready. He lifted Rogers up and put him in his over-the-shoulder backbreaker. Rogers would submit, but the bell had never rung to start the match. And while the match wasn't official, in Ray Morgan's mind, and now more importantly, the fans' mind, Sammartino was the winner and would walk out with both checks. With a hot angle fans wanted to see, it seemed that Rogers and Sammartino would be the cornerstone to the WWWF's future, with their previous matches at the start of Rogers' reign and their August 1962 matches drawing 13 and 14,000 fans respectively to the Maple Leaf Gardens. Rogers would retain the title both times, but it proved that Sammartino and Rogers were a proven commodity. But a day before that segment would air, on April 18th, Rogers would be in Pittsburgh to wrestle in the Civic Arena. Problem is, he would be told by the Athletic Commission he was in no condition to perform. The next day, he would go to Pittsburgh's Mercy Hospital and go for a more comprehensive exam, but no one knows aside from Rogers and his doctors what was actually said to him that day. He would still travel to Cleveland for a rematch with Dory Dixon, but once again, a doctor from the State Athletic Commission barred him from competing. Upon learning the news, McMahon would send Rogers to Georgetown Hospital, where the champion would learn he suffered a series of small heart attacks, and a big one might be on the way. Having to no-show dates in the ring, Rogers would be hospitalized and then later limited to appearing on TV to antagonize his challenger and duck any chances of them facing off, utilizing the soon-to-be mastered trope of chicken shit heel work to, in a sense, give a 7-week build to help Rogers rest. This was also happening the same week that Alex Karras and Dick the Bruiser were doing what they were doing in Detroit. So it gave them a lot of cover in the wrestling press, and holy hell, is this like the biggest week in modern pro wrestling history? With Sammartino returning to TV with his eyes on the title and Rogers basically suffering from low-grade death, you also have Karras and the Bruiser turning the NFL's biggest scandal into a storyline. This feels like where modern wrestling really gets its footing, especially in the terms of turning chicken shit into chicken salad. Rogers turned on that old Nature Boy charm, though, and refused to defend against Sammartino on TV, and saying without $25,000 being put on the line from the challenger, that match wasn't going to happen. He was using that $25,000 because Rogers wanted to, quote-unquote, ruin Sammartino physically and financially. But the thing is, Sammartino would go for it, after quote-unquote making a deal with MSG promoter Walter Johnston. See, the thing is, Sammartino would pay Rogers the $25,000 out of the 50% share of the gate receipts the Italian star was set to get for that evening's card. Speaking to the press heading to the match, Johnston alerted fans that the Garden would need to sell out for Sammartino to make a quote-unquote few $1,000s out of this seemingly one-sided deal to finally get another shot at Rogers with the world title on the line. A fever pitch was brewing as Rogers saw the writing on the wall and wanted assurances from McMahon that if he was healthy enough by August of that year, he'd face Sammartino again in a rematch where Rogers would get his win back in front of potentially the biggest gate in pro wrestling history. McMahon looked to placate his current star and budding star with acrimony on both sides of the aisle leading up to and especially after the impending May date at the Garden. After weeks of build-up on TV, Rogers no-showing a few towns but still making some mandatory appearances for McMahon in Gilzenburg and Washington and Newark, New Jersey, respectively. Inside the refurbished Madison Square Garden on May 17, 1963, Bruno Sammartino would beat Buddy Rogers in 48 seconds, with the same backbreaker he'd used on television just a month prior. With Sammartino as the champion, Rogers' schedule would shift back significantly, but as the summer of 1963 and that all-important rematch was beginning to get closer and closer on the calendar, the Nature Boy was looking to return to that top spot. Problem was that Rogers' health was not improving, and Sammartino's drawing power was. Wrestling in multi-person tags or matches that last less time than your average modern attention span was not enough for Rogers, who wanted back on top and with the title. With McMahon kayfabing everyone he could while trying to keep his nascent federation alive, he'd bring Rogers back to television on July 25th to set up the return match, which would take place at Roosevelt Stadium in Jersey City. Rogers' return to TV would see him team with old partner and running buddy Johnny Berend, and would set up the two to face Sammartino and fellow top attraction Bobo Brazil, where Rogers would shockingly take the first fall. Tag matches were 2 out of 3 falls, especially in New York City, but with the deciding fall in the air, it would come down to Berend and Rogers, who would take the win inside Madison Square Garden. Just over a month later, on August 29th, Willie Gilzenburg would preside over what many might consider the first televised contract signing in pro wrestling, or at the very least the first in WWE history, for the Jersey City Showdown. During that press conference, Gilzenburg claimed that maybe up to 40,000 fans would show up to the ballpark, that Jackie Robinson played baseball at one point, and the ICW would look to run a major show in just over a decade later. Despite the contract signing, despite the win inside the Garden, Rogers would soon find himself again at odds with McMahon, as both would see the writing on the wall. A major blow-up between the two occurred, and Rogers would no-show an MSG card on September 16th. That was to be the last big card before Roosevelt Stadium. With that essentially being Rogers' notice, Gorilla Monsoon would take Rogers' spot, and in front of a less than stellar crowd of 8,103 people paying $23,236, or $236,000 in modern money, facing Sammartino in the main event, where it would end up with a disqualification. Not really what anybody wanted anyway. Oy. An interesting set of themes here as we head back to our friend Mr. Powers. First and foremost, the study of Bruno Sammartino and Buddy Rogers feels like an amalgamation of a lot of the things modern fans have seen over the last 30 years. The Montreal Screwjob, CM Punk, Cody Rhodes. Hell, if you dig into what's going on just in 1963, AEW, ECW, WCW, Impact Wrestling, you could trace all of that back to what goes down in the year of 1963. And with Sammartino and Rogers, we have that same level of kayfabe, subterfuge, and plans change, pal, that existed in 1997. And whether or not Sammartino knew about the heart condition or not, he maintained for a while, I think up until the end, that Rogers never knew the finish heading into that night at Madison Square Garden. Whether or not the younger McMahon took notice of this parable in 1997 hasn't really been discussed to my knowledge in the tens of thousands of hours dedicated to that night in Montreal, but it does show that nothing in wrestling is ever really new. Especially with how Rogers and Sammartino both mirror CM Punk and Cody Rhodes towards the middle of the last decade. Punk was a burnt-out top guy working on false promises from a McMahon and was so banged up he could have died. Rhodes was a talent that decided to do things his own way and came back to the fold when it was most advantageous to him. And probably, like Bruno, got that guaranteed title run. Powers is a lot like a proto Cody Rhodes too. Perceptive, understanding of both the art and commerce of the business, along with studying and developing it to leverage the most success possible and then becoming office of a national territory. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead, carts, horses. And while he would get his start in Detroit working under the protege of Doyle and Barnett, the Sheik, and get a deeper education in Pittsburgh under the eyes of Mont McMahon and Ace Freeman, it would be the territory that Johnny Powers first started watching as a young man. That would be where he defined his future in pro wrestling.
I watched it was the Dumont Network. You got a picture of this for you folks that are a little younger than me. My dad had a 5-inch screen, black and white. We would, all us kids, get around, laying on the carpet rug, watching a little 5-inch monitor, black and white, and on it would be from Buffalo, New York, on channel 2 or 4 or 7 there, and we would see the Lou Theszes and the Vern Gagnes and the Killer Kowalskis, all in black and white, and so they were magical characters, almost mythical characters.
Next week, we dive deeper into Johnny Powers becoming the proto Cody Rhodes, how he got the TV show named after him, and a Super Bowl of wrestling. Historically Speaking is a production of Ember Media and the Intergalactic Sports Network. Rate, review, comment, and subscribe because it really helps. You guys on YouTube are so awesome. Thank you so much for spending the time and, watching the videos, clicking through, and YouTube's recommending it, so hopefully more people continue to join us as we go down the road of secret wrestling history. But next time, bye!